thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm sharing some new historical research I've been doing on David Honeyman and his early work on the glacial geology of Nova Scotia. Coinciding with the pandemic, I was stuck at home, so had an opportunity to do a lot of diving deep into the history of the geology of Nova Scotia and framing my work into understanding the importance of the Nova Scotia Museum Geology collection. So in doing that, I'm creating this timeline that goes back 200 years. So in all these timelines, I'm learning about the people and places the work is being done, interactions between these groups, and able to zone in on different times and try to understand the interactions that are going on, as well as the technology, so age of sail versus age of rail, or autos and planes, or world wars, or whatever is happening. So seeing some patterns there. So I wanted to focus this talk on the work I've been sort of focusing on Dr. Reverend David Honeyman, who was the first curator of the Nova Scotia Museum. So shown at the top there, that provincial museum bar. David Honeyman was born in Dundee in 1817, trained in language and natural history in Edinburgh, and then took up training as a minister, and then became disillusioned with the ministry a little bit, entered the Free Church, immigrated to Nova Scotia in 1848. So he did a little bit of ministering here, but then read J.W. Dawson's Acadian Geology and pursued geology from that point. He was Nova Scotia's representative at the London, Dublin, and Paris International Exhibitions. So he would have been in Europe for about 6 months at a time, interacting with about 3 million people during those sessions, representing Nova Scotia geology. So in specific, I want to focus on the sort of the latter part of his career, sort of the last major delegatory geology that he did when the British Association for the Advancement of Science came to Montreal for their 1884. So in giving the context for the glacial work that David Honeyman did, here in Nova Scotia, the sort of history of glacial work would go back to Lyell in 1842, during his month here in Nova Scotia, started his trip in Halifax and went to Point Pleasant Park to see the glacial striations that were there. But you have to remember, Lyell was much more advocating for the drift. So icebergs bringing in the material and not sort of accepting the glacial theory. Whereas Agassiz would come to Halifax in 1846, didn't go to Point Pleasant Park, but apparently was here for 6 hours. So went up from the boat to see some striations, perhaps at Citadel Hill. So there's the duality. You've got the drift of icebergs versus glacial theory of Agassiz. And that's the sort of context that was still going on, that debate was still going on when David Honeyman was doing his work. So he published his summary of work in 1883 when he was at the Fisheries exhibition. So he went to London for another one of these exhibitions, and he produced a paper that he gave at the Geologists Association. So that's what I want to talk to you about, but more specifically, I want to talk to you about a map that I found in the museum that I think is incredibly significant once you know the story about this map that ties in with his talk. His talk and his paper detail his work over 10 years, his interest in glacial processes or evidence go back to 1873. So I'll mention that. So this talk is all about this map and trying to understand the significance it played in his work and in his presentation of that work to the British Association meeting in 1884. The map itself is hand-colored and annotated on top of an Admiralty chart of Halifax Harbor that was printed or published in 1855. So just remember, that would be like me using a map from 2000. Not really a big deal. Not much is going to change in 20 years from 1853 to 1884. So that's what he used. He used what was at hand to mark his observations. And so again, it's in detail, his work's in detail in this paper that he published with the Geologists Association. The Geologists Association would have been extremely significant to David Honeyman. When he was in London in 1862, he was nominated as the first honorary member of this historic group. And he presented the paper in July while he was there at the Fisheries Exhibition, as I mentioned. So a little bit about the map, or detailing in on the map. So he noted by hand coloring certain areas of the coast here. So this is just outside of the harbor. So Cow Bay, and he's noting certain areas of the beach where he's observing what he sees as amygdaloid basalt, which he recognizes as coming from Blomidon. He picked up the pebble and he says, this is amygdaloid basalt, and I've seen this at Blomidon. This is Oscar, my field dog. We went to the site just last month and found amygdaloid basalt of various sizes. Pause for scale. So that's what he's marking with the colored area there. In the Halifax area, so we are sitting right here, Halifax Citadel, and the lines and arrows are pointing the glacial striations. He's measuring the direction. And so as his paper describes, his work there goes back to 1873. The HMS Challenger came into port in May of 1873, the sort of first oceanographic study, like 5-year study. And the crew had 2 Scottish fellows on board, so they sort of grew friendship with David Honeyman, and he took them on a personal tour to Point Pleasant Park, took the whole crew, and this photo is from the HMS Challenger notes. This is the oldest photo I know of Point Pleasant Park glacial striations. So David Honeyman giving a tour to the crew in 1873, and those pebbles that he found at Cow Bay were the same year. So he's starting to put together these observations. The map also shows out past York Redoubt, rocking stones. He's marked the location of those. And this is the very famous Spryfield rocking stone. Just got this photo from the National or NRCan Photo Archive. So this is actually Goldthwaite in 1914 at this site that Honeyman visited. Everyone has visited this rocking stone. So Goldthwaite would then publish about 10 years later the physiography of Nova Scotia. So we have the drift and the striations and the erratics described in this paper in 1883 while he's in London, and this map is used as his reference point. But like all good works, he shared it again at another conference in 1884. At the Montreal conference, he gave a similar or same, perhaps slightly revised talk on the geology of Halifax Harbor. So that's all of interesting, but what I became particularly interested in is we have a great conference this week, and we've had some great trips before, and we're going to have some great trips after, and that's exactly what they did at the British Association meeting as well. So this is a really big deal for a British Association to come to Montreal. There was a handbook of Canada that was published. It's basically an immigrational promotional material for Canada, giving you facts and figures, and also a separate book on how to get here and how to travel around in Canada, maps of the railroads and things like that. So these excursions were really important, and it turns out that David Honeyman wrote about them in the Nova Scotia Institute of Science, and there was 2 of them. There was one before the conference. So he briefly mentions that just a paragraph in that paper that he took a couple of the delegates that are on their way from Britain to Montreal, to Point Pleasant Park, and he pointed out the striation zone. They talked about the amygdaloid basalt. I've also found newspaper reports that show that those two folks, the Matthew Blair and Reverend Kavanaugh, came at the same time, just a few days before. So any of these other people in the newspaper clipping could have also been on this trip around August 15th, probably. Matthew Blair, just a few years later, posthumously, would publish The Surface Geology of Paisley. So perhaps inspired by this work that he saw with Honeyman. Honeyman published in the Geologists Association, the British Association, Nova Scotia Institute of Science. He also published in this really amazing journal that I've just found out about recently from Pat, archivist at Acadia, called the Canadian Science Monthly. It was published out of Wolfville by Albert Pinio. It was published for a few years. Citizen science, sort of educational material. And David Honeyman wrote several articles for that. And one of them, again, is a description of excursion, but this one happening after the conference. So he talks about who was there, but have also found, again, newspaper clippings that show a larger list of the people beyond what David Honeyman was mentioning. So delegates from Britain, as well as New England, so Professor Richards at MIT. Delegates from Britain include the president of the Geological section of the British Association, the vice president of the Geological Society, but there was also politicians, so the premier of Nova Scotia and the future premier of Nova Scotia were going to be there. Edwin Gilpin, government sort of mines workers, Robert Moreau, the president of NSIS, educators, both at university and high school level, and several newspaper folks. So David Honeyman is involved in this post-conference tour. Topley, one of the folks mentioned there, would have been known to David Honeyman for his work on the geology of the Weld, but also I found interesting, Topley was presenting at the British Association meeting this sort of first study of whether we could artificially influence erosion on a coast. I'm really interested in these time periods and looking back at what we knew and what we didn't know, what we took for granted and what we were just learning for the first time. So we were just starting to look at how we can have an impact on coastal erosion. So a map from 1879, blowing up to show Amherst at the top. This is Bay of Fundy, Minas Basin. This is Windsor, and we're down here in Halifax. So this second trip started on Saturday. They met in Amherst, took a special train to McCann, carriage ride to Joggins, and I've actually found, because of those three reporters, there's really great description of all of the shenanigans that they got up to while they're checking out all these sites. And this one I just loved, sort of spoke to me as sort of a Ralph Stay moment, maybe. So a description of this trip back from Joggins to McCann. The journey back to McCann was devoted to cultivation of musical gifts of the journeyers, the editor of the Amherst Gazette, Professor Lawson, Dr. Honeyman, the ex-premier, young Mr. Buckley. Mr. Leckie did the best of the singing. Those who cannot sing remarked encore. So it's a pretty fun trip, and the newspapers get into describing the things they got into. Sunday, Sabbath, they didn't do anything. It's kind of interesting. Monday, they spent looking around Spring Hill Mines. They went to Parsbro. This is the Parsbro Pier. They stayed at the Ottawa House, all these delegates. They took the ferry on Tuesday to Windsor, looked at the gypsum quarries there, and they would have passed Blominen. So pointing out, David Honeyman would have pointed that out. They then took an evening or night train to Halifax, staying aboard the train. They wake up in the morning, they have breakfast, They went to the gold mines. In the afternoon, they went to see the glacial striations. So it's in this context that David Honeyman pulled out his map. And just if you think about the trip that they had just been on, they would have seen the material at Blominen near Windsor. He would have pointed out the amygdaloid basalt boulders that were nearby. And he's able to draw these lines very similar to the lines that they had just traveled upon. So that's the story of David Honeyman's map from 1884. Tells the story of his knowledge around a decade of work of observations. And for this conference, I also had the really cool privilege to use a printed copy of his map to lead a Jane's walk on Dartmouth Commons. And so using the Cow Bay pebble that I found and the map, engaging with over 50 people to talk about this information as well. So that's a summary. Just in terms of, I think his work has been important in terms of he would have been the first Nova Scotian to advance the glacial theory. Dawson, I believe, died, still accepting Lyell's theory of iceberg rafting drift. So tribute to David Honeyman, and again, thanks for the opportunity to speak at this session that honors Ralph's Day.